Hello, everyone. Gordon Causey. And right now, it's after midnight, so it's the 10th of October, 2023, 1:18 a.m. I'm starting a little later. I had intended to start at 1:15, but stuff happens. And I have a dog, and this seems a little trite to be doing my normal routine given the weight of what I'm going to be talking about. But Candy has her expectations. She doesn't know about the war in Israel. Lay down. Speak. Speak. Good. That buys me peace, as I always say. And as I always say, likewise, if you want to like, share, subscribe, you're more than welcome. I think what I'm going to say is going to be somewhat different than what you might hear on the nightly news. I'm endeavoring to take a middle of the road view on what's happening in Israel. My own personal view is that this is inevitable, that this has to happen. The writing has been on the wall for a very, very long time, at least since 1948. What has happened recently, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel, is on record as saying that Israel's response, their reaction, their war that they've declared on Hamas, that it is going to, quote unquote, change the Middle East. He's not just talking about changing Israel. He's talking about the Levant, the Middle East. It's been called the Orient. It's had a lot of different monikers over the course of human history, and history is important here. I've got to go way back, not in ancient history, more modern history, but this region, biblical Palestine, if you will, prior to the First World War, it was the domain of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't a country in the modern sense of the word. It was a territory of the Ottoman Empire. When World War I ended, the Ottoman Empire had allied itself with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, with Germany. And so the defeat, the victory of Britain and her allies after World War I led to Britain gaining control of this region. And from that point forward, from at the end of World War I, 1918, it was referred to as British mandated Palestine. And then we fast forward into World War II, and after hostilities had ended in World War II, the World Jewish Congress called on every displaced Jewish person because after World War II, there were a lot of DPs. They were called displaced persons, and a lot of them were Jewish. A lot of them were from Europe, and they had no place to go. They had no homes, no nation. And so the World Jewish Congress called on them to go to Israel, to go to what was then British mandated Palestine. And this gets into the whole Zionism, this idea of a Jewish homeland, which is something that has existed throughout the centuries. There have been individuals advocating for a recreation of biblical Israel going back at least until the 1800s and probably prior. At any rate, so the war ended, 1945, VJ, victory over Japan, and the British tried to maintain British mandated Palestine, but conflict started breaking out between the Jewish settlers who had come into Israel and the Arab population that had been there over 1900 years. The Jewish population is called the Jewish diaspora. After Rome had conquered Israel and destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, the Jewish presence in Israel had been minimal. It was predominantly Arab, predominantly Islamic. And so now there was conflict. Jewish nationalists, or some would say Zionists, formed a group called Urun. It's spelled Irgun. It's likely a Hebrew word. I'm not familiar with it. I just know the name of the group, Urun, Irgun. And they were labeled as a terrorist organization, and they murdered British soldiers. And the big event that occurred, from my reading of history, was the bombing of the King David Hotel, which I believe was in Jerusalem. It resulted in the killing of men, women, and children. Urun claimed that they warned ahead of time because they didn't want to. They say they didn't want to cause casualties, and that their warnings were ignored. And so men, women, and children were killed in this bombing of the King David Hotel. And that was pretty much, as I understand it, that was more or less the tipping point. And that led Great Britain to finally say, okay, fine, you can have it. We will establish a Jewish nation state. And in 1948, I think it was in May, the nation state of Israel was created, a modern Jewish state. Thing was, there was already a large Arab or Palestinian population in place. And I'm here to say that the notion, everyone always talks about this two-state solution. We need to have a two-state solution. We need to have a Palestinian state, and we need to have an Israeli state. That, from the get-go, has always been an utter and total impossibility. That's opinion. And the reason I say that is because the Palestinians and much of the Arab world views the very existence of Israel to be abhorrent. They want Israel gone. You can hear some of the rhetoric that has come out of Iran over the years. They want Israel gone. And Israel, I believe their leadership from the very start recognized that the Palestinian population within their borders represented something of a fifth column. If you haven't heard that term before, it refers to an enemy within. So there's this fifth column. And so Israel has invoked a strategy wherein there are areas, lands that have been designated as Palestinian territory. And we've all heard the stories of Israeli settlements going into Palestinian territory. And you've likely seen a map where they show how these Palestinian settlements are disjointed, they're scattered, they're geographically removed from one another. And personally, I think that's intentional, and I also think it's required, simply because divide and conquer. If the Palestinians were in a geographic area in large numbers, that it would represent a threat to Israel's very existence. And I would suggest that what we have just seen in the past few days, starting on Saturday, is proof of that fact, because the West Bank has a population of 3 million Palestinians, and there are roughly 5 million Palestinians in total. So that's the largest concentration of Palestinians within Israel's borders. And we've just witnessed what they have been able to achieve. And I was reading an article. I try and look at things from all sides. I've said before in previous videos that the first casualty of war is the truth. And I'm just scrolling through the article because there's a quote at the end of it by Hamas individual. And I'm just trying to find it. Yeah, his name is, this is Ahmad Habat, a member of the Palestinian party Fatah. And basically what he said is they're in it for all-out war. They want they want a state. They want statehood. They want to have what Israel has. They want a Palestinian state, something that in the modern sense of the word has never existed. There has never been a Palestinian state. And there was never an Israeli state in the modern sense of the word. Israel, as a Jewish nation state, had not existed since the year AD 70, Anno Domini, year of our Lord. So this is messy. This is a very, very messy situation. And going back to history, I already mentioned World War I. And I don't claim to be a historian. I don't claim to be an expert on world history. I'm an avid reader of world history. I'm very interested in world history. But one thing I'm very much aware of is the fact when it comes to history, so much depends on one's perspective, one's biases, one's background. And, I'll just throw out a quick little example. The American Revolutionary War had the British viewed the American revolutionaries in today's terms, they would be called terrorists. And the Americans, of course, their revolutionaries were viewed as freedom fighters. Had Britain won that war, the likes of George Washington and Paul Revere and the rest, they would have gone down in history as terrorists. But because they won, they are the fathers of the United States, and they're the founding fathers. History is a very interesting topic, but so much of it is clouded history. I'm not the one to say this. Millions have said it before me. History is written by the winners. So if you go back to World War I, what we saw was dominoes falling. Archduke Ferdinand was murdered. He was the heir presumptive, or the presumptive heir, to the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And he was assassinated, murdered by a Serbian, and that led to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire declaring war on Serbia. And then what we had was there were alliances that had been building up in the decades prior. Everyone had their little dance partners. And so once Austria-Hungary, that empire, declared war on Serbia, dominoes started to fall. And by the end of 1914, a large part of the world was at war with one another. And part of that was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had allied itself with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was allied with the loose federation of German states. Wasn't so much an empire. There had been the Prussian Empire, and I can see those similar type dominoes falling now, because what has happened in the wake of this attack by Hamas on Israel is there are two principal reactions that are happening around the world. Countries like the United States are condemning the attack, and in condemning the attack and calling it a terrorist act by framing it in this context. And again, I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to stay as close to the middle as I can. By condemning it and calling it a terrorist act and using this type of language, it justifies Israel's response. Netanyahu is declaring war. There's talk of a ground assault, of them sending in troops, basically now boots on the ground, to use a militaristic term, going into the West Bank. That's been the response of much of the European Union, the United States. However, that's not been a universal response. Saudi Arabia has basically said they have called for restraint on both sides. They've called for a cessation of hostilities. They have not condemned the attack as terrorist. They haven't used the same language that countries like the United States have used, and that's significant because in not condemning the attack, they are justifying, to a degree, they are justifying Hamas's attack on Israel. And putting myself in the shoes of those who hold the opinion that Hamas was justified, I understand the rhetoric and the rationale that the rhetoric they employ and the rationale behind it. They say that Israel has basically been subjugating the Palestinian population. The West Bank, there's, you talk about a border wall, there is a barrier between, in a fashion, it's been described as a prison. And to go in or out of the West Bank, you have to go through a military checkpoint. So for Palestinians and those who support Palestine, they say this is unacceptable. We need to be an autonomous nation. Again, my thesis statement, something of a thesis statement that I said right off the bat, a two-state solution has never been a viable option from an Israeli perspective, because that would create the very ingredients needed to overthrow the nation state of Israel. And I believe that Israel has known this from its inception in 1948, that the creation of a Palestinian state within its borders or bordering Israel, that it's just a recipe for war and threatening Israel's existence and survival. So this is, well, I've got to go on, and I'm sorry. I haven't scripted this out. I'm flying by the seat of my pants, just straight out the thoughts that are in my head. But that was Saudi Arabia's response. So in a fashion, one could see it as giving Hamas justification. China has issued a similar type declaration, calling for a cessation of hostilities and etc., with no condemnation for Hamas's attack on Israel. And now Lebanon, which borders Israel to the north, so you have the West Bank, which is more or less in the southwestern part of Israel. Now there's the potential for a two-front war. And I've read reports that rockets have been coming into Israel from Lebanon. You've heard the country Beirut, that's Lebanon. And Lebanon harbors a group like Hamas in the West Bank, and the group is referred to as Hezbollah. And it is widely believed and reported that both Hezbollah and Hamas are militarily supported, financed, funded, trained by Iran. And this is where the dominoes come in. So you have you have the Palestinian population concentrated largely in the West Bank. Then you have Hezbollah in Lebanon. You have both of them being funded, trained, armed by Iran. With Israel, they have their proxies undermine Israel's security. Well, Iran is allied with Russia. And Russia has signed a no limits partnership. I would invite you to look that up. No limits partnership, Russia, China. Take that for taken at face value. That means whatever Russia does, China's okay with it. Whatever China does, then Russia is okay with it. And so we're at a point in world history, getting back to World War One. World War One, one of the sobriquets applied to that war, it had a few. One was the end of empire. It was called the war to end all wars, the Great War, and another name it was given was the end of empire, because up until that point in history, 1914, you had the Japanese Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. You had a burgeoning American Empire, the French Empire, British Empire. You had all these empires. And largely the world had been carved up already. Everyone had there was no more real estate to conquer. There was no low-hanging fruit. Everyone had their land holdings. The Spanish, the British, the French, the Russians, the Japanese, they all had their, and there was no more indigenous populations who were not technologically advanced, who could easily be conquered and taken over. And so now war was costly. And so almost like a final party, well, let's have just one, rather than Spain and the United States or Britain and France, or rather than just having little wars, let's all go at it. And they all went at it. And the world map basically changed forever. And we entered into the dawn. You used to, under that old system, as a Canadian, I was a subject of the British Empire, a subject of whoever the king was at that time, King George. I'm not sure exactly who was the king in World War One, but I was his subject. And nation states were all carved up and belonged to varying empires. And then we had a kind of a new world order came into effect. And then we had individual nation states. And that's more or less been what's existed from the end of World War One until now. We did, of course, have World War Two, and that was not empires fighting, that was nation states fighting against each other. And out of World War II, the United States emerged as the predominant world power, counterbalanced somewhat by the old Soviet Union. And those were the two dominating world powers. Now we're in a situation, and of course, the end of the Cold War ended with the Soviet Union basically imploding on itself. It collapsed from within. And now it looks like the United States is collapsing from within. The United States is the declining power. China is the power on the rise. Something that I think is significant and did not get a lot of play in our media, and by that I mean the Western media. I see I have someone watching. If you want to put up a comment, please do. I enjoy engagement. And if you think my take on something is wrong, you're most welcome to contradict me, to point out whatever errors you think I've typically, I think I'm sticking very close to the middle, and that I think my opinions are at least historically justified, but there are different takes. But anyway, the significant event that happened within the last year or so, 2 years at most, is that Saudi Arabia and Jordan had for, I think, 5, 6, 7 years, for a number of years, they had shut down all diplomatic relations. There was no diplomatic relations existed, no embassies between the Jordanians and the Saudis. And the reason for that, I believe the reason was because the Saudis were accused of supporting Jordanian rebels or Jordanian insurgents. And Saudi was believed to be undermining the Jordanian regime. And so the two countries had shut down all the diplomatic relations. They just reestablished them within the last year or so. However, the brokering of that deal of getting them back at the table and reestablishing those diplomatic relations, normally that would have been the purvey, that would have been the job, if you will, of the United States of America. They were somewhat of the world's policemen, and they would go in like Jimmy Carter did with what they called the Camp David Accords, where Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin of Israel came together at Camp David and they signed a peace agreement. That's what the United States did. That was their job. Well, it wasn't the Americans brokering this peace deal or this rapprochement of diplomatic relations between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Instead, it was China. And this is where I say China is the rising power. And I think whereas we in the West, Canadians, certainly Americans, Canadians, Western Europeans, NATO type countries, still tend to view the United States as the top dog. I think a lot of the world, Saudi Arabia certainly, definitely Africa, I think they recognize that there's a new top dog in town, and it's the Chinese. It's not the Americans anymore. I equate it somewhat, to use a sports analogy, when you had the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird era in the NBA in the 80s, and then this new guy came along. And there's a story where Larry Bird said to Magic Johnson, there's a new sheriff in town. The Magic Johnson and Larry Bird era declined, and we got the era of Air Jordan. It's a bit of a trite analogy, but I think it fits. And this gets biblical when you start talking about these dominoes falling. I've had to do a bit of catching up on Israel's history. And like the 1967 war, Israel was created as a nation state in 1948. However, it is not it's bigger now than it was when it was created, because Arab nations, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, attacked Israel in 1967. And Israel won that war, and they gained control of the Golan Heights, Syrian territory, which, as I understand it, is still recognized as Syrian territory, but the Israelis won't give it up. And from their perspective, it is of huge strategic significance because they overlook Israel. And so we've all heard the line, you need to have the high ground. That's not just moral high ground, literal. You want to have the high ground. And these Golan Heights had a huge strategic advantage if there's a military conflict. And so Israel capturing those Golan Heights helped them to ensure their security. They also captured East Jerusalem, and that is even more significant because now we get into the Temple Mount. There's the Dome of the Rock, and then there's another mosque, and this is considered the third most holy site in Islam. There's Mecca, Medina, and I can't even say it, this mosque, Al something. I should learn how to say it if I'm going to do a video, but regardless. And as I understand it, Jews are forbidden from East Jerusalem. It's such a complicated arrangement, but it's the Jordanians who somewhat manage it. Somewhat. But they're with a strong Israeli presence. And Jews are not supposed to be able to apparently worship in this area on the Temple Mount near this Al whatever mosque. And they apparently, the Jewish authorities have been lax in enforcing that restriction, and Jews have apparently, reportedly, allegedly been worshiping there. And for members of the Muslim faith, the members of the Islamic faith, Muslims, that has been put forward as a desecration by having these Jewish worship taking place, is desecrating this holy Islamic site. You talk about a mess of a situation, and the Hamas and their leaders, they say they went into this eyes open, and they're in it to win, and they're in it, what they expect to win is the creation of a Palestinian state. And I've said it right off the bat, so I'll end my video at this point. Hi, Beth. Appreciate you jumping on and saying hi. I don't know if you just got on because I've covered a lot of ground, but I said off the bat, and I'm going to end it here. Hamas has stated that their intention Beth is saying she just jumped on. The Hamas is saying that they went into this eyes open, and you can call it an undeclared declaration of war. A surprise attack. And it sounds to me like they anticipated the Israeli response, and they are in it to win it, and they want to see the establishment of a Palestinian state, the so-called two-state solution, which, as I said off the bat, is absolutely, completely unworkable. You cannot have a two-state solution. You cannot have two populations so ingrained with generational hatred. It's Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's the former Yugoslavia all over again. This has always been inevitable. If I go to the Bible and Gospel Matthew 24, Matthew 24 talks about wars and rumors of wars. This was my last video. And Jesus said, all this must take place. That's something of my view. This must take place. It has been inevitable from the start. This would be resolved if they had accepted Jesus and lived up to him. The one thing I would say on that, Beth, is I'm just trying to collect my thoughts, but I'll take it to Judas. If Judas hadn't betrayed Jesus to the religious authorities in Jerusalem, then Jesus would not have gone to the cross. Then there'd be no atoning sacrifice. Death would not have been conquered. Judas had to betray Jesus. This has to take place. It's been prophesized. I don't pretend to understand every aspect of Revelation, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the various end times eschatological prophecies. There's so much symbolism. There's histories that we've forgotten, that have been lost to the sands of time, images that we don't understand the way they would have been understood 2,000 and more years ago. But in broad strokes, what is supposed to happen is Armageddon. There's supposed to be a major battle, global in scope, armies from around the world, and we have dominoes falling. We have Hezbollah and Hamas funded and trained, armed by Iran. We have Iran allied with Russia. We have Russia in a no limits partnership with the Chinese. You look at Revelation, the kings of the East, Gog and Magog, and There's varying interpretations. People will tell you, oh, I know who Gog is this one and Magog is that one, and they'll tell you they know. The difficulty is prophecy. We don't typically, what often happens is, or what usually happens is, people only are able to put everything together after the fact. Okay, so that's what this meant. Now I'm able to figure it out. So when I look at end times theology, eschatology, I tend to look at it from 100 miles up and don't try and get too much into the nitty gritty, because it is far too complicated, and you can go wrong too many different ways. But in broad strokes, this is looking like it has that very much that potential that we could see dominoes start to fall, and is Saudi Arabia going to get involved? What about Egypt? What about Jordan? Israel is a tiny sliver of a nation. It's in an ocean. It's a tiny little Jewish island in a sea of Islam. So that's the end. And God bless Beth. She says, yes, it takes time. His kingdom come. God bless. On earth as it is in heaven. But we're not there yet. And certain things, again, to echo what is written in Matthew chapter 24, I don't know the exact verse. All this has to take place. But then Jesus said, but the end is not yet. This is but the birth pangs. So a new world order is coming, not the new world order planned by the global elites, who I view as satanic. I'm now getting into opinion here, but it is more than just opinion, it's belief. There are forces, the ultimate power. You've got to get on the side of Jesus Christ. There is a war coming. It has to happen. And God is calling God is calling you home. If you recognize the lies and the deception and the propaganda that has been taking place, and it's happened throughout all of human history, but it's just accelerating now. And his sheep recognize his voice. And if you're seeing the lies, the deception, and the propaganda, listen for that voice. So I'll end it there. God bless. And I'll probably be doing more of these regularly, because this is, forget COVID. That's, I can see things blowing up. I can see us being confronted with a multi-headed beast, to use a term from Revelation. We'd have the beast of COVID, the beast of the war in Ukraine and Russia, the beast of this war that's happening now. So we could have disease, war, famine. What happens during war? Food production is affected. Global supply chains are affected. I could go on for an hour and a half, 2 hours, just rambling on about this stuff. Beth, thank you so much, and amen. Jesus is the Savior of the world. That's the gospel good news. This life is not the end. And that's where you can find peace, hope, and even joy in troubling times such as this, is to know that we are not home. This has to take place for us to get home. I went on a vacation. Most people will have gone on a vacation. Well, you got to pack your bags. You've got to save up the money. You got to do a lot. There's a lot of unpleasant things that have to take place, but then you get to go on vacation. Well, that's a very trite example. But we're Christians are going home. Those of us, if you've acknowledged Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, professed him as Lord, then you're going home. So I'll end it there. God bless. This wasn't really a sermon type post, but may the Lord bless and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. And we'll see you again when I do my next video. Ending stream.